Sometimes the people we love most leave us gifts we don't understand until it's almost too late. When little Elsie's grandmother Irene passed away, she left her old house to a 6-year-old girl and her dog, Buck. The family laughed and called it worthless, just a falling down place covered in vines. But Elsie felt something special about that house. She asked her sad father if they could visit just once before they gave it away. The house was barely standing when they got there. But in the dusty attic, behind an old wall, Elsie and Buck found something amazing. Old papers and pictures that had been hidden for years. What they discovered would change everything the family thought they knew about their past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of the modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floor that Elsie's mother had once polished to a shine. 6-year-old Elsie sat cross-legged on her bedroom carpet, carefully brushing the golden fur of her German shepherd Buck, who lay patiently beside her with the kind of devotion that only dogs possess. "There you go. Boy," she whispered, her small fingers working through a tangle behind his ear. Buck's tail thumped softly against the floor, his dark eyes never leaving her face. He had been her constant companion for 3 years now, ever since her mother Sarah had passed away from cancer, leaving Elsie and her father Michael to navigate their grief together. Michael stood in the doorway, watching his daughter's gentle ritual. At 34, he had aged considerably in the past 3 years, his brown hair showing premature grey at the temples and worry lines etched around his eyes. He worked double shifts at the automotive plant to keep their small household afloat. But moments like these reminded him that some things mattered more than overtime pay. "Breakfast is ready, sweetheart," he said softly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful scene. Elsie looked up with the kind of smile that could mend a broken heart. "Buck says good morning, Daddy." Michael couldn't help but smile back. Elsie had always claimed she could understand what Buck was thinking, and sometimes Michael almost believed her. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense her moods, appearing at her side whenever she felt sad or frightened. During the long nights after Sarah's death, when Elsie would wake crying for her mother, Buck would pad into her room and rest his massive head on her bed until she fell back asleep. They made their way to the small kitchen, where Michael had prepared scrambled eggs and toast, simple fare but made with love. The kitchen table was actually Sarah's grandmother's dining set, refinished by Michael's own hands during better times. Now it served as their center of family life, where they shared meals and Elsie did her homework while Michael paid bills. "Grandma Irene used to make the best pancakes," Elsie said suddenly, cutting into her eggs. "She put blueberries in them and made them into funny shapes." Michael's chest tightened at the mention of his mother. Irene had passed away just 2 weeks ago, quietly in her sleep at the nursing home, where she'd spent her final months. She had been 82, and while her death wasn't unexpected, the loss still felt sharp and sudden. More than that, her final wishes had created a family controversy that Michael was still trying to understand. "I remember those pancakes," he said, settling into his chair. "She made them every Sunday when I was your age. She told me stories too," Elsie continued, her voice taking on the dreamy quality it always held when she spoke about her grandmother. "About the old house where she grew up, and about how houses can hold memories like treasure boxes." Michael paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. This was the first he'd heard about his mother telling Elsie stories about any old house. As far as he knew, Irene had grown up in a series of apartments on the south side of town. Her own parents had died when she was young, and she'd never spoken much about her childhood. "What old house, sweetheart?" "The one with the blue door and the climbing roses." She said it was waiting for someone who would understand its secrets. Elsie took a bite of toast, seemingly unaware of the impact her words were having on her father. "She said someday I might see it." A chill ran down Michael's spine. Yesterday, he had received a call from his mother's attorney requesting a family meeting to discuss the will. When he'd asked if there were any surprises, the lawyer had been evasive. mentioning only that there were some unusual provisions that needed to be discussed with all family members present. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed his sister Janet's number. "Morning, Janet," he answered, stepping away from the table. "Michael, please tell me you've talked some sense into that lawyer." Janet's voice was sharp with frustration. "This whole meeting thing is ridiculous. Mum had nothing but that small savings account and her social security. What could be so complicated about her will?" Michael glanced back at Elsie, who was now feeding small pieces of egg to Buck under the table, a practice he usually discouraged, but somehow couldn't bring himself to stop today. "I don't know any more than you do," he said, "but we'll find out at 2 o'clock. Well, I hope it's quick. Tom and I have plans this afternoon, and frankly, I'm tired of dealing with all this estate nonsense. Mum should have just left everything in joint accounts like normal people do." After hanging up, Michael returned to the table to find Elsie looking at him with those perceptive eyes that sometimes seemed far too old for her 6-year-old face. "Is Aunt Janet mad about something?" she asked. "She's just sad about Grandma Irene, like we all are," Michael said, though he suspected Janet's emotions were more complicated than grief. His sister had always been practical to a fault, and she'd made no secret of her opinion that their mother's final years at the nursing home had been an unnecessary financial burden. The lawyer's office was located in a converted Victorian house downtown, its waiting room filled with heavy wooden furniture and the scent of old leather books. Michael sat between his two sisters, Janet and Carol, while their spouses whispered among themselves in the corner chairs. Elsie sat quietly beside him, Buck at her feet. The attorney had surprisingly agreed to allow the dog in the office after Michael explained that Elsie was still processing her grief and needed her companion's support. Attorney Harrison. Wells was a man in his 70s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had known Irene for over 20 years, handling her simple legal needs and witnessing the gradual changes in her personality as she aged. What he was about to reveal would surprise even him. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Wells began, settling behind his mahogany desk. "As you know, we're here to discuss Irene's final wishes. I must say, she was quite specific about how this meeting should be conducted." He opened a thick manila folder and withdrew several documents, including what appeared to be a handwritten letter. "First, let me read you something Irene wrote just 3 days before she passed away." He cleared his throat and began to read in a voice that carried the weight of years. "To my dear family, I know this will come as a surprise, but I have made my final decisions with a clear mind and a full heart. I've watched you all struggle with the burden of my care, and I understand the practical concerns that drive your thinking. But there are some things more important than practical concerns, and there are some gifts that can only be given to those who still have the eyes to see them." Janet shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Mr. Wells, if we could just get to the specifics." "Please," the attorney interrupted gently. "Irene insisted this be read in full." He continued, "I am leaving my house at 1247 Elm Street to my granddaughter Elsie and her faithful companion Buck. I know you will think this is foolish, that a 6-year-old child has no use for an old house. But Elsie has something the rest of you have lost, the ability to see with her heart instead of her calculator. That house holds more than you know, and she is the only one I trust to discover its true value." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Janet stood up abruptly. "That's impossible. Mother lived in that nursing home for 2 years. She didn't own any house." Mr. Wells consulted his papers. "Actually, she did. The property at 1247 Elm Street has been in her name for over 40 years. She's been paying taxes on it through an automatic withdrawal from a separate account you weren't aware of." Michael felt the world tilt slightly. 40 years? "But she never mentioned—" "There's more," Mr. Wells continued. "The letter goes on. Michael, I know you will want to protect Elsie from this responsibility, but I am counting on you to trust my judgment one last time. Take her to see the house. Let her walk through it. And if she feels what I think she will feel, then you'll understand why it had to be her." Carol, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "What kind of condition is this house in?" If it's been sitting empty, it hasn't been empty, Mr. Wells said quietly. Irene arranged for minimal maintenance through a local caretaker. The house is, well, it's old and it needs work, but it's structurally sound. Janet's husband, Tom, leaned forward. What's the property worth? We could sell it and put the money in a college fund for Elsie. That's just it, the attorney replied. According to the will, the house cannot be sold without Elsie's consent, and she cannot give that consent until she reaches the age of 18. Until then, the property is held in trust, with Michael as the trustee responsible for its care. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the bookshelf. Michael looked down at Elsie, who had been listening to the entire conversation with remarkable composure for a 6-year-old. Sweetheart, he said gently, do you understand what this means? Elsie nodded solemnly. Grandma Irene left me her secret house, the one with the blue door. Mr. Wells's eyebrows rose. How did you know about the blue door? She told me stories about it. She said it was waiting for me. The attorney opened his desk drawer and withdrew an old brass key, ornately carved with scrollwork that seemed far too elaborate for a run-down house. She asked me to give this to you personally. Elsie took the key with both hands, holding it as if it were made of precious metal. Buck, who had been lying quietly at her feet, suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the window. His ears pricked forward as if he heard something no one else could detect. Janet stood up again, her frustration evident. This is ridiculous. A 6-year-old can't own property. She can't maintain it or make decisions about it. This whole thing needs to be contested. Actually, Mr. Wells said firmly, the will is quite legal and was drawn up with great care. Irene was of sound mind when she made these decisions, and she anticipated there might be objections. She left specific instructions about that as well. He produced another document. If any family member attempts to contest the will or pressure Elsie to sell the property, they forfeit any claim to other assets in the estate. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Michael realized his mother had been far more strategic in her final planning than any of them had imagined. There is one more thing, Mr. Wells continued. Irene wanted the family to visit the house together before any final decisions were made about its future. She felt that once you saw it, you might understand her reasoning. As they left the lawyer's office, Michael's siblings made their displeasure known in no uncertain terms. Janet declared the whole thing a senile old woman's fantasy, while Carol worried about the financial burden of maintaining an old house. Their husbands suggested finding legal loopholes, and everyone seemed to have an opinion about what should be done. But Michael found himself watching Elsie, who walked beside him with unusual quiet, the ornate key clutched in her small fist. Buck stayed close to her side, occasionally looking up at her face, as if checking her emotional state. That evening, after a dinner filled with tense phone calls from relatives, Michael sat on Elsie's bed as she prepared for sleep. Buck had already claimed his usual spot on the rug beside her bed, his presence a comforting constant in their ever-changing world. "Daddy," Elsie said softly, "are you mad about the house?" Michael considered his words carefully. His practical side agreed with his sisters. A 6-year-old inheriting property was unusual and potentially problematic. But something about his mother's final wishes felt deliberate and meaningful in ways he couldn't yet understand. "I'm not mad, sweetheart. I'm just confused. Your grandmother never told me about this house. She said grown-ups sometimes forget how to see important things." Elsie turned the key over in her hands, studying its intricate design. She said kids and dogs remember better. As if summoned by his name, Buck lifted his head and gave a soft whine that sounded almost like agreement. "Would you like to see the house?" Michael asked, surprising himself with the question. Elsie's eyes lit up with the first real joy he'd seen from her since Irene's death. "Could we, tomorrow? I suppose we could drive by just to see what we're dealing with." But even as he said the words, Michael had the strange feeling that tomorrow's visit would be about much more than satisfying curiosity. His mother had been many things, A devoted wife, a loving mother, a woman of quiet strength, but she had never been whimsical or impractical. If she had left this house to Elsie, there had to be a reason that went deeper than sentiment. As he turned off Elsie's bedroom light, Michael found himself looking forward to tomorrow with a mixture of anticipation and unease. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the maple trees, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once before the night settled into peaceful silence. The next morning arrived grey and overcast, with the kind of October chill that promised winter wasn't far behind. Michael had barely slept, his mind churning over his mother's unexpected revelation and the family conflict that was sure to follow. He'd received 3 more phone calls the previous evening. Janet threatening to hire her own attorney, Carol worrying about property taxes, and his Uncle Robert demanding to know why he hadn't been mentioned in the will at all. Elsie, however, had slept peacefully for the first time since Irene's death, the ornate key tucked safely under her pillow. She woke with an unusual energy, practically bouncing out of bed and asking every few minutes if it was time to go see her house. After breakfast, Michael promised, though he found himself dreading the visit as much as his daughter anticipated it. He had driven past Elm Street countless times over the years, but had never paid attention to the house numbers. Now he wondered how he could have missed something his mother owned for 4 decades. The drive across town took them through neighborhoods that had seen better days. Elm Street sat in what had once been the historic district, where grand Victorian homes had housed the city's most prominent families in the early 1900s, but urban development and economic changes had transformed the area into a patchwork of restored showplaces and neglected eyesores. "It's right up there," Elsie said suddenly, pointing ahead with the certainty of someone who had made this journey many times before. Michael slowed the car and felt his breath catch in his throat. 1247 Elm Street stood behind a wrought-iron fence that was more rust than metal, its elaborate gate hanging askew on broken hinges. The house itself was a 3-story Victorian, painted in what might once have been yellow, though decades of weather had faded it to the color of old newspapers. Ivy covered most of the exterior walls, creeping up past the wraparound porch and threatening to claim the 2nd-story windows. But even in its deteriorated state, the house retained an undeniable dignity. Its architectural bones were solid, bay windows, decorative gingerbread trim, and a distinctive blue front door that somehow managed to maintain its vibrant color despite the surrounding decay. "Oh," Elsie breathed, pressing her face against the car window. "It's just like she described." Michael parked on the street and helped Elsie and Buck out of the car. The sidewalk leading to the house was cracked and uneven, weeds pushing through the concrete like nature's slow-motion rebellion against human plans. The yard, which must have once been carefully landscaped, had become a wild tangle of overgrown shrubs and volunteer trees. As they approached the front gate, an elderly African-American woman emerged from the house next door. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that seemed to hold decades of neighborhood history. "You must be Michael," she said, walking toward them with measured steps. "I'm Dorothy Washington. I've been keeping an eye on Irene's place." Michael felt a flush of embarrassment. "Mrs. Washington, I'm sorry. I had no idea my mother owned this property." "If I'd known, she didn't want you to know," Dorothy said gently. "Not until the time was right. And this must be little Elsie." Elsie stepped forward with the natural courtesy her parents had taught her. "Hello, Mrs. Washington. Buck and I came to see our house." Dorothy's face broke into a warm smile. "Well, hello, Buck." She extended her hand to let the dog sniff her fingers. "Irene told me all about you. She said you were a very special dog who would know how to take care of Elsie." Buck's tail wagged slowly, as if he recognized something familiar about this woman, despite having never met her. "You've been taking care of the house?" Michael asked. "Just the basics," Dorothy replied. "Irene hired a boy to cut the grass once a month during the summer, and I've been checking on things, making sure no one bothered the place." She paid me a small amount to keep an eye out, but honestly, I would have done it anyway. That house has been part of this neighborhood for over a century. Michael looked up at the imposing structure, trying to reconcile this reality with his understanding of his mother's life. Mrs. Washington, can you tell me how long my mother owned this place? I'm having trouble understanding. That's not my story to tell, Dorothy said firmly but kindly. But I will say this. Irene was a remarkable woman who understood the value of patience. Some things can't be rushed, and some secrets can't be revealed until the right person is ready to receive them. She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small silver key. This is for the back door. Irene said the front door key was special and should only be used by Elsie when she was ready. Michael took the key, his confusion deepening. How often did my mother come here? More than you might think, especially in recent years. Even after she moved to the nursing home, I'd drive her over once a month. She'd sit on that front porch for hours, just looking at the house like she was memorizing every detail. Elsie tugged on her father's jacket. Daddy, can we go inside now, please? Michael looked at the house again, noting the sagging porch steps and the ivy-covered windows. I don't know, sweetheart. It might not be safe. The structure is sound, Dorothy interrupted. Irene had it inspected every few years. It needs cosmetic work, but the foundation and bones are solid. Victorian houses were built to last. Against his better judgment, Michael found himself walking toward the back of the house, Elsie skipping beside him, while Buck trotted ahead as if he knew exactly where he was going. The backyard was as overgrown as the front, but there was evidence of someone's care. A small cleared area near the back door where a few late-season flowers still bloomed in what had once been a garden. The back door opened easily, revealing a mudroom that led into a spacious kitchen. Despite the dust and the musty smell of a house too long closed, Michael could see that someone had maintained the basics. The electricity worked when he flipped the light switch, and when he turned the kitchen faucet, water flowed freely. Grandma Irene kept it nice for us, Elsie said matter-of-factly, as if inheriting mysterious houses was perfectly normal. The kitchen retained many of its original Victorian features: high ceilings, tall windows, and beautiful hardwood floors that only needed refinishing to restore their original luster. A large oak table sat in the center of the room, and on the windowsill above the sink, someone had placed a small collection of flowering plants that were somehow still alive despite the house's apparent abandonment. Buck immediately began exploring, his nose to the ground as he followed scents that told stories Michael couldn't read. But the dog's behavior was calm and confident, as if he were familiarizing himself with a place he was meant to be. They moved through the house slowly, Michael checking for hazards while Elsie absorbed every detail with the intensity of someone trying to match reality to long-held dreams. The dining room featured a massive built-in china cabinet with leaded glass doors. The living room boasted a fireplace with an elaborate mantel carved from what looked like cherry wood. But it was on the mantel that they found the first real clue about Irene's connection to this place. Sitting prominently in the center was a hand-carved wooden bird, painted in bright blue and yellow. Underneath, someone had carved the initials IH plus JW. In elegant script, IH must be Irene Henderson, Michael said, using his mother's maiden name. But who is JW? Elsie picked up the bird, turning it over in her hands. Grandma Irene made this. She showed me how to carve when I was little. She said wooden birds carry messages between people who love each other. Michael felt that strange chill again. His mother had never shown him any wood-carving skills, and he'd never seen her create anything artistic. Yet the craftsmanship of the bird was clearly the work of someone with considerable skill. As they continued through the house, more questions arose than answers. The furniture, while old-fashioned, was well-maintained and expensive. Fresh flowers, clearly placed recently, sat in vases throughout the main rooms. Someone had been caring for this place with more attention than simple maintenance required. It was Buck who led them to the most intriguing discovery of the day. While Michael examined a bookshelf filled with what appeared to be first-edition novels, Buck began pawing at a loose floorboard near the staircase. His whining grew more insistent until Elsie knelt beside him. "He wants us to look here," she announced. Michael joined them and found that the floorboard was indeed loose, though not from age or wear. Someone had deliberately made it removable. When he lifted it, he found a small metal box containing old photographs and what looked like letters tied with a faded ribbon. "Should we open it?" he asked, though he realized he was asking a 6-year-old for permission to explore his own mother's belongings. "Grandma Irene left it for us to find," Elsie said with complete certainty. "Buck wouldn't have shown us if it wasn't okay. The photographs were old, dating from what looked like the 1940s and 1950s. They showed a young woman who was unmistakably his mother. But Irene looked different, more confident, more vibrant than he remembered her being in later years. In several photos, she was with a handsome young black man, both of them smiling with the kind of joy that comes from being deeply in love. The letters were addressed to "My dearest Irene" and signed "All my love, James." Even reading just the first few lines, Michael understood that these were love letters from a relationship that had clearly been serious and meaningful. "Daddy," Elsie said softly, "why do you look sad?" Michael sat back on his heels, the photographs scattered around him like pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed. His mother had been 23 when she married his father in 1960. These photos and letters suggested a whole chapter of her life that had been completely hidden from her children. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. I'm just surprised your grandmother had stories I never knew about." As they prepared to leave the house, Dorothy Washington was waiting for them by the back gate. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. "I'm not sure we knew what we were looking for," Michael replied honestly. "Mrs. Washington, the man in the photographs, James, do you know what happened to him?" Dorothy's expression grew solemn. "That's a story for another day, Michael. But I will say this. Your mother was a woman of great courage, and she loved that man with all her heart. Sometimes life doesn't let us choose the path we want to walk. But that doesn't mean the love was any less real." As they drove home, Elsie clutched the wooden bird in her lap, while Buck sat contentedly in the back seat. Somehow more relaxed than he'd been in weeks. "Are we going to keep the house, Daddy?" Michael looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror, her face bright with hope and possibility. The practical part of him knew this inheritance was complicated, financially, legally, and emotionally. But something about the house, about his mother's careful planning, and about Elsie's obvious connection to the place, made him hesitate to dismiss it too quickly. "We'll see, sweetheart. We need to understand more about what your grandmother wanted us to do." That evening, the phone calls from family members came fast and furious. Everyone wanted to know what they'd found, whether the house was sellable, and when Michael planned to come to his senses about this impractical inheritance. But as he tucked Elsie into bed, Michael found himself thinking less about his family's objections and more about his mother's hidden love story. The woman in those photographs looked like someone he'd never met, someone who had dreams and passions and secrets that she'd carried alone for decades. "Daddy," Elsie whispered as he turned off her light, "I think Grandma Irene wants us to find more treasures in the house." "What makes you think that?" "Because Buck knows where they are. He just needs time to show us." As Michael closed his daughter's bedroom door, he realized that tomorrow he would call his office and take a few days off work. Whatever secrets his mother had hidden in that old house, whatever story she'd been trying to tell them, he owed it to her memory and to Elsie's inheritance to uncover the truth. Michael took 3 days off work, something he hadn't done since Sarah's final hospital stay. The decision surprised him as much as it did his supervisor, but he found himself driven by a curiosity that wouldn't be satisfied by a single afternoon visit. Elsie had begged to return to their house every day since the discovery, and Buck seemed equally eager, pacing by the front door each morning as if he had important business to attend to. On their second visit, they arrived to find Dorothy Washington sitting on her front porch with a cup of coffee and a knowing smile. "Thought you might be back today," she called out. That house has a way of calling to people. This time, they entered through the front door, using Irene's ornate key. It turned smoothly in the lock, as if it had been recently maintained. The front hallway was grander than anything accessible from the back entrance. A wide staircase with an intricately carved banister swept upward to the second floor, while afternoon light filtered through stained glass panels that cast rainbow patterns on the hardwood floors. Elsie immediately gravitated toward the staircase, running her small hand along the banister with obvious delight. "Can we see upstairs?" "Carefully," Michael agreed, though he found himself as curious as his daughter about what they might discover. The second floor contained 4 large bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, all with the high ceilings and decorative moldings typical of Victorian architecture. But it was the master bedroom that held the most surprises. And like the other rooms, which were furnished but felt unused, this room showed signs of recent occupancy. Fresh linens covered the bed, and on the nightstand sat a small digital clock that was still plugged in and working. The closet contained a few items of women's clothing in sizes that would have fit his mother during her later years. Most intriguingly, the dresser top held an array of personal items: a silver hairbrush, a small jewelry box, and a leather-bound journal. Michael opened the journal with trembling hands, half expecting to find it blank. Instead, he discovered entries in his mother's familiar handwriting dating back over 10 years. October 15th. Came to the house today to check on the roses James planted along the back fence. They're still blooming 40 years later. Amazing how some things endure when others fade away. I think about him every day, wondering what our life might have been like if things had been different. The entry was dated just 3 years ago. Michael flipped through more pages, finding regular entries that painted a picture of his mother as a frequent visitor to this house, someone who had maintained it not just as property, but as a shrine to a lost love. May 3rd. Elsie came to visit me today at the home. She's so much like I was at her age, sees things others miss, believes in possibilities that adults have forgotten. I've made my decision. She'll understand what this place means, even if the others can't. Daddy, look what Buck found. Elsie's voice called from the hallway, interrupting his reading. He found her kneeling beside Buck in front of a linen closet, where the dog was pawing at something behind the bottom shelf. Michael moved the linens aside and discovered that the back panel of the closet was actually a small door, barely 3 feet high and painted to blend with the surrounding wood. The door wasn't locked, but it had clearly been designed to be inconspicuous. "It's like a secret passage," Elsie whispered, her eyes wide with excitement. The small door opened onto a narrow staircase that led up to what must have been the 3rd floor, though from the outside, the house appeared to have only 2 stories. Michael used his phone's flashlight to illuminate the way, and they climbed carefully upward until they emerged into a large attic space that had been converted into a private study. Unlike the rest of the house, this room felt lived in and loved. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes on history, literature, and social justice. A comfortable reading chair sat beside a window that provided a view of the entire neighborhood. And covering one entire wall was a collection of photographs, documents, and newspaper clippings that told a story Michael had never imagined. The centerpiece was a large photograph showing a group of people, both black and white, standing together in what looked like a church basement. They were holding signs with messages like "Equal rights for all" and "Justice cannot wait." In the front row, unmistakably, stood his mother and the same young man from the photographs they'd found downstairs. "This is from 1961, Michael read from the caption written in his mother's handwriting. First integrated planning meeting for the Freedom Rides. Elsie was examining a display case that contained what appeared to be a collection of memorabilia. "Daddy, what's this?" She pointed to a faded train ticket stub. Michael looked closer and felt his breath catch. The ticket was dated August 28, 1963, from their hometown to Washington, D.C. The date was familiar. It was the day of the March on Washington, when Dr. King had delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. "Your grandmother went to the march on Washington," he said, still trying to process this revelation. "She never told anyone in the family." The room contained dozens of similar artifacts, letters from civil rights organizations, photographs of demonstrations and meetings, even what appeared to be a hand-drawn map showing safe houses and meeting locations. It was clear that his mother had been far more than a passive supporter of the civil rights movement. She had been an active participant. Buck had settled himself comfortably in the reading chair, as if he belonged there. His calm demeanor suggested that, unlike Michael and Elsie, he wasn't surprised by these discoveries. How did Buck know about this room? Michael wondered aloud. "Dogs remember smells," Elsie said matter-of-factly. Grandma Irene probably brought him up here before. But Michael was certain his mother had never owned a dog, and Buck had only been part of their family for 3 years. Yet the dog's behavior in the house suggested a familiarity that couldn't be explained by their brief visits. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the attic study, uncovering layer after layer of his mother's hidden history. She had been involved in voter registration drives, had helped organize integrated community events, and had maintained correspondence with civil rights leaders well into the 1970s. Most poignantly, they found a series of love letters from James that revealed the full scope of their relationship. He had been a teacher, an activist, someone who had shared Irene's passion for social justice. Their relationship had lasted for several years, but the letters grew fewer after 1963, and the final one, dated 1964, spoke of impossible circumstances and a love that society won't accept. As the afternoon light began to fade, Michael realized they had been in the house for nearly 6 hours. Elsie showed no signs of fatigue, moving from discovery to discovery with the endless energy of childhood curiosity. Buck remained their faithful guide, leading them to corners and crevices that held additional secrets. Before leaving, Michael made a decision that surprised him. He took several of the photographs and documents, including his mother's journal, planning to study them more carefully at home. As they locked up the house, he noticed Dorothy Washington working in her garden. "Mrs. Washington," he called out, "can I ask you something?" She straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Of course. Did you know about my mother's involvement in the civil rights movement?" Dorothy's smile was both sad and proud. "Your mother was one of the bravest women I ever knew. In those days, it wasn't easy for a white woman to take the stands she took. She lost friends, faced criticism from her own family, and eventually had to choose between the life she wanted and the life that was possible." What happened to James? "He went to California in 1965, got married, became a principal. Your mother married your father that same year. They both chose the paths that seemed safest at the time." Dorothy paused, studying Michael's face. But neither of them ever forgot what they'd shared. James sent her a Christmas card every year until he passed away about 10 years ago, as they drove home. Michael found himself seeing his mother's life and his own family's history in an entirely new light. The woman who had raised him with quiet dignity and strong moral principles had once been a young activist, willing to risk everything for her beliefs. "Daddy," Elsie said from the back seat, "are we going back tomorrow?" "Yes, sweetheart. I think we have a lot more to discover." That evening, while Elsie played with Buck in the living room, Michael sat at the kitchen table reading his mother's journal entries. Each page revealed another layer of the woman he thought he had known completely. Her writing showed intelligence, passion, and a deep commitment to justice that she had apparently carried throughout her life, even when circumstances forced her to express it more quietly. One entry, dated just 6 months before her death, stopped him cold. "The house holds all our stories, mine and James's, but also the stories of everyone who found refuge there during the dangerous years. Elsie will understand someday why it had to be preserved. Children see truth more clearly than adults. They haven't learned yet to compromise their hearts for the sake of convenience." Michael closed the journal, his mind racing. What did she mean by everyone who found refuge there? And how could a 6-year-old possibly understand something that he, at 34, was just beginning to grasp? But as he watched Elsie whispering to Buck about their next adventure, Michael realized that his daughter did seem to understand something fundamental about the house and its significance. She approached each discovery with reverence rather than mere curiosity, as if she instinctively recognized the importance of what they were uncovering. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Janet's name appeared on the caller ID. "Michael, I hope you're not getting carried away with this house nonsense," she said without preamble. "Tom talked to a realtor today, and even in that condition, the property could be worth $200,000. That's college money for Elsie. Janet, there might be more to this than we initially thought. What could possibly be more important than Elsie's future education? Mom was clearly not thinking straight when she made that will. We need to be the adults here and make practical decisions." After hanging up, Michael returned to his mother's journal. But this time, he was reading not just for understanding, but for clues about what she had really intended for Elsie to inherit. The house was clearly more than property. It was a repository of history, a keeper of secrets, and perhaps most importantly, a test of whether the next generation would choose to preserve the past or sacrifice it for immediate gain. The third day at the house brought an unexpected visitor. As Michael and Elsie arrived with Buck in tow, they found a well-dressed man in his 50s standing at the front gate, examining the property with the calculating eye of someone who saw dollar signs rather than history. "Excuse me?" the man called out as Michael helped Elsie from the car. "Are you the family that inherited this place?" Michael's protective instincts immediately kicked in. "Can I help you with something?" The man extended a business card with a practiced smile. "Richard Caldwell, Caldwell Development. I represent a group of investors interested in this block. We're prepared to make a very generous offer for this property." "The house isn't for sale," Michael replied. Though even as he said the words, he wondered why he was being so definitive. "Everything's for sale at the right price," Caldwell said smoothly. "This lot, combined with the 2 adjacent properties we've already acquired, would make an ideal site for a modern shopping complex. We're talking about bringing jobs and commerce to a neighborhood that clearly needs revitalization." Elsie stepped closer to her father, instinctively sensing the threat this man represented to her inheritance. Buck positioned himself between the child and the stranger, his hackles rising slightly. "I said it's not for sale," Michael repeated more firmly. Caldwell's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew colder. "Mr. Henderson, I understand this has sentimental value, but look around you. This house is a liability, old, requiring massive repairs, sitting in a declining neighborhood. My clients are prepared to offer $300,000, cash as is. That's well above market value for a property in this condition. $300,000. The number hit Michael like a physical blow. It was more money than he'd ever imagined having at one time. Enough to secure Elsie's entire future, pay off his mortgage, and provide financial security he'd never known. "That's very generous," he managed, "but as I said, the property isn't available." "Think about your daughter's future," Caldwell pressed. "College tuition, opportunities, security. This house will only drain your resources and tie up capital that could be working for you." After Caldwell left with a promise to keep the offer open, Michael found himself shaken by the encounter. $300,000 would change their lives completely. How could he justify turning down that kind of money based on his mother's mysterious wishes and a 6-year-old's intuition? Inside the house, Dorothy Washington was waiting for them in the kitchen. She had used her key to let herself in and was arranging fresh flowers in a vase on the windowsill. "I saw that developer talking to you," she said without preamble. "Caldwell's been sniffing around this neighborhood for months, buying up properties. Mrs. Washington, I need to ask you something directly. My mother obviously trusted you with the care of this house. Do you think she would want Elsie to keep it, even if selling it could secure her financial future?" Dorothy set down the flowers and looked at him with eyes that had seen decades of difficult decisions. "Michael, your mother knew about the development pressure. She knew what this property might be worth. She also knew something else. something she hoped you and Elsie would discover before anyone pressured you into making a decision you'd regret later. What kind of something? Instead of answering directly, Dorothy led them to the basement door. There are parts of this house I haven't shown you yet. Parts that Irene asked me to wait on until you were ready. The basement was typical of old houses: stone foundation walls, exposed beams, and the musty smell of decades. But like everything else about this property, it held surprises. In the far corner, behind what looked like a coal storage area, Dorothy showed them another hidden space. This one was different from the attic study. It was clearly designed for concealment, with a false wall that opened onto a small room furnished with cots, blankets, and shelves stocked with canned goods. On the wall, someone had painted a simple but unmistakable symbol, a star pointing north. This house was a station, Dorothy said quietly. Not just during the Underground Railroad, though it served that purpose too, but during the civil rights era, when activists needed safe places to meet, when people needed somewhere to hide from those who would do them harm. Michael stared at the room, trying to process this revelation. My mother helped hide people here? Your mother and James both. This was one of several safe houses in the network. People would come here when demonstrations went wrong, when they needed medical attention, when they needed a place to plan the next action. Dorothy ran her hand along one of the walls, where dozens of names were scratched into the stone. Everyone who found refuge here left their mark. Elsie was examining the names with intense concentration. Mrs. Washington, are these all the people Grandma Irene helped? Some of them. Your grandmother was part of something bigger than herself, something that changed this country for the better. As they explored the hidden room, Michael found himself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what his mother had been involved in. These weren't just historical curiosities. They were evidence of genuine heroism, of people who had risked everything for principles that most of society wasn't ready to accept. But more than that, they were proof that this house held significance far beyond its market value. It was a monument to courage, a testament to the power of individuals to make a difference, and a link to a critical chapter in American history that was in danger of being forgotten. Buck had found a comfortable spot on one of the old cots, as if he had been there before. His presence seemed to calm the atmosphere, making the space feel less like a museum and more like a place where people had found hope in dark times. Mrs. Washington, Michael said, how many people know about this? Not many. Most of the original network members have passed away, and their children don't know the stories. The Historical Society has some records, but they don't know about this specific house. She paused, studying his face. Your mother was very concerned about that. She felt like important history was being lost because people were embarrassed or afraid to talk about the past. As they prepared to leave the basement, Elsie discovered one more significant artifact. Tucked behind a loose stone in the foundation was a small metal container holding a collection of photographs showing the house during its active years as a safe haven. The pictures showed people of all ages, families with children, elderly couples, young activists, all finding shelter and support in this place that his family now wanted to tear down for profit. That evening, Michael sat in his living room with the photographs spread across the coffee table, while Elsie and Buck played quietly in the corner. Each image told a story of courage and community, of people who had believed in something greater than their own immediate interests. His phone had rung 6 times since they'd returned home, family members wanting updates, Janet demanding to know when he planned to list the property, and even a second call from Richard Caldwell, who had somehow obtained his number and wanted to discuss increasing the offer. But as Michael looked at the photographs, he began to understand what his mother had been trying to tell them. This wasn't just about preserving a building or honoring family history. It was about recognizing that some things were too important to be sacrificed for money, no matter how desperately that money might be needed. Daddy, Elsie said, looking up from her coloring book, when people were scared and needed help, they came to our house, didn't they? Yes, sweetheart. They did. And Grandma Irene made sure they were safe. She did, Elsie nodded solemnly, as if this confirmed something she had already known. That's why we can't sell it. Because what if someone else needs help someday? Michael felt tears prick his eyes. His 6-year-old daughter had grasped in a single moment what it had taken him days to understand. The house wasn't just their inheritance. It was their responsibility. The discovery that changed everything came on a Thursday morning when Buck led them to yet another hidden space, this time behind the kitchen pantry. As Elsie knelt beside the dog, watching him paw insistently at what appeared to be solid wall, Michael wondered how many more secrets this house could possibly hold. The false panel opened to reveal a small safe, old-fashioned but well-maintained, with a combination lock that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. On top of the safe, someone had left a sealed envelope with "For Elsie" written in Irene's careful handwriting. Inside the envelope was a photograph that made Michael's breath catch in his throat. It showed a much younger version of his mother, standing with a group of people in front of the very house they now stood in. But this wasn't just any group. Michael recognized several faces from his childhood history books. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood in the center, his hand resting on the shoulder of a young black minister. Beside him stood Rosa Parks, her quiet dignity evident even in this informal photograph. On the back of the photo, Irene had written, March 1965, planning meeting for the Selma to Montgomery March. Our house, our kitchen table, our commitment to justice. My God, Michael whispered. She hosted planning meetings here, but it was the combination to the safe that provided the most emotional moment. Written on a small piece of paper in the envelope were the numbers 082863, the date of the march on Washington, a day that had clearly held profound significance for his mother. The safe opened easily, revealing documents that would change not just their understanding of the house, but potentially its legal status as well. At the top of the pile was a thick folder marked Historical Designation Application Confidential. Michael opened it to find a meticulously prepared application to have the house declared a National Historic Landmark. The application was complete, including architectural surveys, historical documentation, and sworn affidavits from historians and civil rights scholars. It had been prepared by a law firm in the state capital and was ready for submission. It only needed a property owner's signature. She did all this work, Michael said, mostly to himself. She researched everything, prepared all the documentation, but she never submitted it. Dorothy Washington, who had arrived while they were exploring, peered over his shoulder at the documents. She was waiting for the right time and the right person to carry it forward. Why didn't she just submit it herself? Because she knew there would be opposition, and she wanted someone younger and stronger to handle the fight. She also knew that if the designation came through, the property could never be sold for development, no matter how much money was offered. The implications hit Michael like a wave. If the house achieved historic landmark status, Elsie would inherit not just property, but a protected piece of American history. The development deal would become impossible, but so would the financial windfall that could secure his daughter's future. The rest of the documents in the safe painted an even more complete picture of the house's significance. There were photographs of Underground Railroad activities from the 1850s, showing the same basement room being used to shelter escaped slaves. There were newspaper clippings from the 1960s mentioning safe houses in the city without identifying specific addresses. Most importantly, there was correspondence with the National Park Service, indicating that the house met all criteria for landmark status. How many houses like this are left? Michael asked. Not many, Dorothy replied. Most have been torn down, sold, or lost to development. This might be the last intact example of a property that served both purposes, Underground Railroad Station and Civil Rights Safe House. As they studied the documents, Elsie made her own discovery. In the bottom of the safe was a small leather journal, different from the others they'd found. This one was bound with a ribbon and addressed, "For my granddaughter, when she's old enough to understand." Michael opened it carefully, revealing pages of stories written specifically for Elsie. not the historical accounts they'd been finding, but personal stories about courage, about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult, about the responsibility that comes with inheriting something precious. One entry read, "Dear Elsie, by the time you read this, you'll have discovered that our house holds many secrets. But the most important secret is this: some things are more valuable than money, and some responsibilities are more important than convenience. You have inherited not just a house, but a legacy of people who chose to do what was right instead of what was easy." As Michael read the stories aloud, he realized his mother had been preparing for this moment for years. She had documented not just the historical facts, but the moral framework she hoped would guide Elsie's decisions about the inheritance. Their exploration was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Through the window, Michael could see Richard Caldwell accompanied by two other men in expensive suits. "Mr. Henderson," Caldwell called out, "we need to talk. My clients have authorized me to increase our offer significantly." Michael reluctantly answered the door, keeping Elsie and Buck safely behind him. 400,000, Caldwell said without preamble. "Cash, closing within 2 weeks. That's my final offer, and frankly, it's more than generous for a property that's going to require massive investment to be habitable." "Mr. Caldwell, I've told you the house isn't for sale. Everything is for sale. Mr. Henderson, the question is whether you're going to be reasonable about this, or whether we'll have to explore other options." The subtle threat in Caldwell's voice made Michael's protective instincts flare. What other options? "Well, there are always city ordinances about maintaining properties, health and safety inspections, tax assessments. Sometimes the city decides that certain properties are burdensome to the community." Dorothy Washington appeared at Michael's shoulder, her face stern. "Richard Caldwell, are you threatening this family?" "Mrs. Washington, I'm simply explaining the realities of property ownership in a changing neighborhood." After the men left, Dorothy's expression remained troubled. "Michael, I think you need to understand something about the development pressure in this neighborhood. Caldwell and his investors don't just want your mother's house, they want this entire block. They've been working with certain city officials to identify properties that could be declared blighted or unsafe." "Are you saying they might try to force a sale?" "I'm saying that developers with enough money and the right connections can make life very difficult for property owners who stand in their way." That afternoon, as they prepared to leave the house, Michael made 2 phone calls. The first was to the law firm that had prepared the historic designation application. The second was to a local newspaper reporter who specialized in neighborhood development issues. By evening, he had a much clearer picture of what they were facing. The law firm confirmed that the historic designation application was complete and could be submitted immediately, but warned that the process would take months and would certainly trigger intense opposition from development interests. The reporter was very interested in the story and hinted that Caldwell's company had been involved in several questionable deals involving city officials and favorable zoning decisions. As Michael tucked Elsie into bed that night, she looked up at him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see straight into his heart. "Daddy, are we going to fight for the house? What do you think we should do?" "I think Grandma Irene knew this would happen. And I think she left us everything we need to protect what's important." Michael kissed her forehead, marveling at how a 6-year-old could sometimes see things so much more clearly than the adults around her. "You're right, sweetheart. She did leave us everything we need." That night, Michael sat at his kitchen table with the historic designation application spread before him. All it needed was his signature as Elsie's trustee. Once submitted, there would be no turning back, no development money, and no easy answers to his family's growing pressure to sell. But there would also be no more hiding the truth about his mother's legacy, no more pretending that some things couldn't be measured in dollars, and no more wondering whether he had the courage to do what was right instead of what was profitable. The phone started ringing at 7 in the morning. 3 days after Michael had submitted the historic designation application. Janet's voice was sharp with anger when he answered. "Michael, what have you done?" "I just got a call from someone at the National Park Service asking about our mother's house." "Did you actually apply for some kind of historic status without consulting the family?" "I'm Elsie's trustee, Janet. The decision was mine to make. That decision affects all of us. Do you have any idea what you've just thrown away?" $400,000, Michael, gone, because you've decided to play preservationist with a 6-year-old's inheritance. By noon, Michael had received similar calls from Carol, Uncle Robert, and 3 cousins he hadn't heard from in years. Word was spreading through the family network that he had single-handedly destroyed any chance of profiting from Irene's unexpected bequest. But Michael had also received other calls, encouraging ones. The National Park Service historian assigned to review the application called to express excitement about the documentation Irene had assembled. A professor from the state university wanted to visit with graduate students studying civil rights history. Most surprisingly, the local branch of the NAACP had somehow learned about the application and wanted to discuss supporting the designation process. When Michael and Elsie arrived at the house that afternoon, they found Dorothy Washington waiting with an elderly black man who introduced himself as Reverend Samuel Patterson. "I haven't been in this house for almost 60 years, Reverend Patterson said, his voice trembling with emotion. "But I spent 3 nights here in 1965 after a demonstration turned violent. Your mother and James Washington, Dorothy's nephew, probably saved my life." Michael looked at Dorothy with new understanding. "James was your nephew?" "My brother's boy," she confirmed. "He and your mother were, well, they were more than friends. They were partners in every sense that mattered, even when the world wouldn't let them be partners in the legal sense." Reverend Patterson walked through the house with the careful steps of someone revisiting sacred ground. In the kitchen, he ran his hands over the table where so many crucial meetings had taken place. In the basement safe room, he pointed to one of the names scratched into the stone wall. "That's my signature from 1965. I was 22 years old, terrified, and certain I was going to be killed for trying to register voters. This house gave me hope when I had none." As the Reverend shared his memories, Michael began to understand the full scope of what his mother had been part of. This wasn't just local activism. It was a crucial link in the National Civil Rights Network, a place where strategy was developed and lives were saved. "Reverend Patterson," Elsie said with the directness that only children possess, "do you think other people should know about what happened here?" "Child, I think people need to know. Too many young folks today don't understand what it took to get the rights they take for granted. This house is proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to act on their principles." Their conversation was interrupted by another visitor, Richard Caldwell, accompanied this time by a man who introduced himself as City Councilman Bradley Foster. "Mr. Henderson," Councilman Foster said, "I understand you've applied for historic designation on this property." "That's correct." "I think you should know that the city has received several complaints about this house. Neighbors are concerned about safety issues, and there are questions about whether the property meets current building codes." Dorothy Washington stepped forward, her expression stern. "What neighbors?" "I've lived next door for 40 years, and I haven't complained about anything." "Well, there have been general concerns raised about properties in this area." Michael realized he was witnessing exactly the kind of official pressure Dorothy had warned him about. "Councilman, are you here in an official capacity?" "I'm here as a concerned public servant who wants to make sure all parties understand their options. Mr. Caldwell's development project would bring jobs and tax revenue to a struggling neighborhood at the cost of destroying irreplaceable history." Reverend Patterson interjected quietly. "History is important," Foster replied, "but so is progress. Sometimes we have to make difficult choices about what's best for the community's future." After the officials left, Dorothy, Reverend Patterson, and Michael sat in Irene's kitchen, sharing stories and trying to process the magnitude of what they were facing. It was clear that the opposition to historic designation would be intense and well-funded. Your mother knew this fight was coming, Dorothy said. That's why she spent years documenting everything, why she prepared the legal paperwork, and why she chose Elsie as her heir. I don't understand the connection between choosing Elsie and the legal fight. Reverend Patterson smiled. A 6-year-old can't be intimidated by developers or corrupted by money. She sees the truth clearly because she hasn't learned yet to compromise her values for convenience. That evening, Michael received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Angela Morrison, a historian from Howard University who specialized in civil rights sites. Mr. Henderson, I hope you don't mind my calling. I've been in contact with the National Park Service about your historic designation application, and I have to tell you, this could be one of the most significant civil rights sites we've documented. Really? The combination of Underground Railroad activity and 1960s activism, plus the level of documentation your mother preserved, it's unprecedented. But I need to warn you, there will be significant opposition. Properties like this threaten certain narratives about how change happened in America. What do you mean? Some people prefer to think that civil rights progress came from official channels, from government action and court decisions. The idea that ordinary citizens, especially interracial partnerships like your mother and James Washington, were the real driving force makes some people uncomfortable. Dr. Morrison offered to visit the house and conduct a full historical assessment, which would strengthen the designation application. She also warned that the process would likely take 6 months to a year, during which time the development pressure would only intensify. That night, as Michael helped Elsie get ready for bed, she asked the question he'd been dreading. Daddy, are people mad at us for trying to save the house? Some people are, sweetheart. They think we should take the money instead of preserving the history. But if we take the money, then nobody will know about all the brave people who were helped there. That's right. Elsie considered this for a moment. Grandma Irene must have known this would be hard, but she still left it to us. She did. Then we have to be as brave as she was. As Michael tucked his daughter into bed, he realized that she had distilled the entire situation to its essential truth. His mother had passed on more than property. She had passed on a test of character, a challenge to choose principle over profit, legacy over convenience. Buck settled himself beside Elsie's bed with a contented sigh, as if he approved of the decisions being made. Looking at his daughter and her loyal companion, Michael felt a sense of certainty he hadn't experienced since this whole journey began. Tomorrow, he would call Dr. Morrison and schedule the historical assessment. He would also call the newspaper reporter and tell him the full story of his mother's house and the development pressure they were facing. The fight was just beginning, but they had something the developers didn't, the truth, carefully preserved and documented by a woman who understood that some things were too important to be lost to the highest bidder. The discovery that changed everything came from the most unexpected source, Buck himself. On a grey Saturday morning, 3 weeks after submitting the historic designation application, the German shepherd led them not to another hidden compartment or secret room, but to the backyard garden where Dorothy Washington had mentioned that James had once planted roses. Elsie was following Buck as he sniffed around the overgrown flower beds when she called out, "Daddy, there's something buried here!" Michael found her kneeling beside a patch of earth where Buck was pawing persistently at what looked like a corner of metal protruding from the soil. After careful digging, they unearthed a waterproof document case, sealed and intact despite decades underground. Inside was a single piece of paper that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about the house's legal status. It was a land deed, dated 1855, written in the formal language of the pre-Civil War era. But it wasn't just any deed. It was the original purchase document for the property, and it contained a clause that Michael had to read 3 times before he understood its significance. The deed specified that the land had been purchased for the express purpose of providing sanctuary to those seeking freedom from bondage, and for no other use whatsoever, in perpetuity. More importantly, it included a covenant that the property could never be sold or developed for commercial purposes as long as it served its designated humanitarian function. "My God," Michael whispered, sinking onto a garden bench with the document in his trembling hands. "This isn't just about historic designation. The house has been legally protected since 1855. Dorothy Washington, who had been watching from her kitchen window, came out to see what they had discovered. When Michael showed her the deed, her eyes filled with tears. "Irene knew," she said quietly. "She must have known all along. She hired that lawyer to research the property's legal history, but she never told me what he found. The implications were staggering. If the deed was authentic and legally binding, and the paper, ink, and style all suggested it was, then Richard Caldwell's development plans were not just morally questionable, but potentially illegal. The property had been protected by law for over 160 years, but there was more in the document case. Beneath the deed was a letter dated just 1 month before Irene's death, written in her careful handwriting and addressed to the future guardians of this sacred place. Michael read it aloud while Elsie listened with the intense attention she always gave to her grandmother's words. "If you are reading this, then Buck has led you to the final piece of the puzzle. Yes, I knew about the deed restriction all along. I spent the last 5 years of my life working with attorneys and historians to verify its authenticity and legal standing. The house has been protected by law since the day it was purchased by abolitionists who understood that some things are more important than profit. But I also knew that legal protection alone wouldn't be enough. There are always ways around inconvenient laws when enough money and influence are involved. That's why I needed someone pure of heart to inherit this responsibility, someone who would fight, not because the law required it, but because it was right. Elsie, my dear granddaughter, you have inherited more than a house. You have inherited the guardianship of a sacred trust that has been maintained by people of courage for over 1.5 centuries. The deed makes the property legally untouchable, but only if its current guardian has the strength to enforce that protection. The letter went on to reveal that Irene had been in secret contact with other families across the South who owned similar properties. Houses that had served as Underground Railroad stations and later as civil rights safe houses. Many had been lost to development or neglect, but a few remained in the hands of descendants who understood their significance. There is a network of us, Elsie, guardians of memory, keepers of the sacred spaces where ordinary people did extraordinary things. We have been waiting for the right moment to make our existence known to the world. I believe that moment has come, and I believe you are the catalyst we have been waiting for. Most shocking of all was the revelation about Buck's connection to the house. The letter explained that he wasn't just Elsie's pet. He was a descendant of dogs that had been bred specifically to serve as companions and guides for the Underground Railroad network. His unusual ability to find hidden spaces and his calm demeanor in the house weren't coincidence. They were inherited traits from generations of dogs trained to protect and serve those seeking freedom. Buck's great-great-grandfather was James's dog during the civil rights era. When James moved to California, he left the dog with me to continue the bloodline. Buck was born to be the guardian of this house, just as you were born to be its human protector. The final paragraph of the letter contained instructions for contacting the other guardian families, along with the name of a lawyer in Washington, D.C., who specialized in protecting historically significant properties. That afternoon, Michael made the phone call that would change the trajectory of their fight. Attorney Margaret Thornton had been waiting 3 years for Irene to contact her, and she had spent that time preparing for the legal battle that everyone knew was coming. "Mr. Henderson, your mother was part of something much larger than a single property dispute," Thornton explained during their lengthy phone conversation. "We represent 12 families across 6 states, all protecting properties that were part of the Underground Railroad and civil rights networks. The developers and politicians who want to destroy these places are part of a coordinated effort to erase inconvenient history. The lawyer explained that the legal protections were stronger than Michael had realized. Not only was there the original deed restriction, but federal laws protecting historically significant sites, and now the pending National Historic Landmark designation. The combination created multiple layers of legal protection that would be almost impossible for developers to overcome through legitimate channels. But they won't use legitimate channels, Thornton warned. They'll try intimidation, political pressure, and if necessary, they'll attempt to challenge the deed's authenticity or claim that the restrictions no longer apply. She offered to take their case pro bono as part of the larger network's legal strategy. But she also warned that the fight would be public, intense, and potentially dangerous. Your mother understood the risks when she made you Elsie's trustee. She believed that the story of this house needed to be told, regardless of the consequences. That evening, as Michael tucked Elsie into bed, she asked the question that had been on his mind all day. "Daddy, does this mean we don't have to worry about the house anymore?" "It means we have the tools to protect it, sweetheart. But it also means our fight is going to be bigger than we thought." "How much bigger?" Michael considered how to explain to a 6-year-old that they had just become part of a national movement to preserve civil rights history. "Remember how Grandma Irene helped lots of people who needed courage? Well, now we get to help other families who are trying to protect special houses like ours." Elsie nodded solemnly. "So we're not just fighting for our house. We're fighting for all the houses." "That's right. And Buck gets to help because his family has been doing this job for a really long time." As if he understood his role perfectly, Buck lifted his head from his spot beside the bed and gave a single quiet woof of agreement. That night, Michael sat in his kitchen reading through the contact information for the other Guardian families. Tomorrow, he would call them and learn about their struggles to protect similar properties. He would also call the newspaper reporter and Dr. Morrison from Howard University. Because the story was about to become much larger than one family's inheritance dispute. His mother had been preparing for this moment for years, assembling the legal tools, the historical documentation, and most importantly, the moral framework that would be needed to fight not just for one house, but for the preservation of America's hidden history of courage and resistance. As he looked at the deed with its 160-year-old covenant protecting the property, Michael realized that Irene had given Elsie more than an inheritance. She had given her a mission that would define her entire life. And somehow, he knew that his 6-year-old daughter was more than equal to the task. The weeks following the deed, discovery brought a whirlwind of activity that transformed their quiet inheritance dispute into a national story. Attorney Margaret Thornton arrived from Washington with a team of legal researchers who spent 3 days documenting every aspect of the house's historical significance. Dr. Angela Morrison brought graduate students who photographed and catalogued the artifacts Irene had preserved. Most importantly, families from the network of Guardian properties began arriving to offer support and share their own stories. Michael found himself at the center of something far larger than he had ever imagined. The Henderson House, as it was now, being called in news reports, had become a symbol of resistance against what historians were calling heritage erasure, the systematic destruction of sites that told uncomfortable truths about America's past. But the increased attention also brought increased pressure. Richard Caldwell's development company had hired a high-powered law firm that was challenging the deed's authenticity, claiming that 19th-century property restrictions couldn't be enforced under modern zoning laws. City Councilman Foster had announced plans for a special hearing on property maintenance standards that everyone understood was targeted specifically at their house. Most troubling of all, someone had been watching the house. Dorothy Washington had noticed the same car parked on different streets at various times, always positioned where the occupants could observe who was coming and going. She had also received phone calls from strangers asking questions about the neighborhood and specifically about the old Henderson place. "They're documenting our activities. Margaret Thornton explained during a strategy meeting in Irene's kitchen. Standard intimidation tactics. They want us to know we're being watched. The meeting included Michael, Dorothy, Reverend Patterson, Dr. Morrison, and 3 other Guardian families who had driven in from neighboring states. As they sat around the same table where civil rights strategies had been planned decades earlier, Michael felt the weight of history and the enormity of what they were attempting. The legal challenges won't succeed, Thornton continued, but they'll create delays and uncertainty. That's when the real pressure will start. Building inspections, tax assessments, zoning violations. They'll look for any excuse to declare the property uninhabitable. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, whose family protected a similar property in Alabama, leaned forward. They tried the same tactics with us. Suddenly, our 150-year-old house didn't meet modern electrical codes, needed expensive foundation repairs, and posed a public safety risk. It took 2 years and $50,000 in legal fees to fight them off, but we won, added her son, David, and the publicity from the fight actually helped us secure additional legal protections. Dr. Morrison had been taking notes throughout the meeting. From an academic perspective, what we're dealing with here represents a crucial moment in civil rights preservation. If we can successfully protect this house and tell its story properly, it could change how America understands its own history. Elsie had been sitting quietly in the corner with Buck, listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus she always brought to important matters. Finally, she spoke up. Mrs. Thornton, what happens if we win? The lawyer smiled at the directness of the question. If we win, Elsie, your house becomes protected forever. It becomes a place where people can come to learn about courage and about how ordinary people change the world. And if we lose, it gets torn down and becomes a shopping center. Elsie nodded thoughtfully. Then we can't lose. The simplicity of her statement brought smiles to the faces around the table. But Michael recognized the steel in his daughter's voice, the same quality he was now understanding his mother had possessed. That evening, as the visiting families prepared to return to their own battles, Reverend Patterson asked to speak with Michael privately. They sat on the front porch while Elsie played with Buck in the yard. Michael, I need you to understand something about what's happening here. This fight isn't really about your house, and it isn't even about preserving history. What is it about? It's about whether we believe that truth matters more than profit, whether we think some things are sacred enough to protect even when it costs us something. The elderly minister looked out at the yard where Elsie was teaching Buck a new trick. Your mother understood that, and she knew that Elsie would understand it too. But why Elsie? Why not me, or one of the other adults in the family? Because adults learn to compromise their principles when the stakes get high enough. Children haven't learned that lesson yet. They still believe that right is right and wrong is wrong, period. The next morning brought news that changed the entire dynamic of their situation. The National Park Service had completed its preliminary review of the historic designation application and had fast-tracked it for approval. More significantly, the story had been picked up by national news outlets, and donations were pouring in from across the country to support their legal fight. But the news also brought their opponents into the open. Richard Caldwell held a press conference announcing that his development project would create 200 jobs and generate millions in tax revenue. He characterized the preservation effort as misguided nostalgia that was blocking economic progress in a struggling neighborhood. We respect history, Caldwell said to the cameras, but we can't let sentimentality prevent us from moving forward. This neighborhood needs investment and opportunity, not museum pieces. City Councilman Foster appeared alongside Caldwell, announcing that the city was indeed proceeding with the property maintenance hearing. We have to balance historical interests with public safety and economic development. No one wants to see unsafe structures preserved simply because they're old. That afternoon, Margaret Thornton called with more concerning news. They're not just challenging the deed anymore. They're claiming that the house itself is structurally unsafe and should be condemned for public safety reasons. Is that possible? Anything is possible if you have enough money and the right connections. We need to get our own structural engineer to do an assessment before they can claim the property is dangerous. The engineer's report, completed over the weekend, confirmed what Dorothy Washington had been saying all along. The house was structurally sound and had been well maintained despite its age. The Victorian construction methods had actually proven more durable than many modern building techniques. But even as they scored legal victories, the personal pressure on Michael and his family intensified. Janet called daily, alternating between anger and pleading as she begged him to reconsider. His co-workers at the plant had begun making comments about his crusade, and he had overheard conversations about whether someone who put politics ahead of his family's financial security could be trusted with greater responsibilities. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Michael arrived at work to find his supervisor waiting with uncomfortable news. "Mike, I've got to ask you about this house situation. Corporate has been getting calls from people asking about your activities. They're concerned about the company being associated with controversial political positions." "It's not political, Jim. It's about preserving history. I understand that, but some people see it differently. Look, nobody's saying you can't do what you're doing, but maybe you could keep it a little quieter. The last thing any of us needs is negative publicity affecting the plant." That evening, Michael sat at his kitchen table with Elsie, sharing a simple dinner and watching his daughter work on a school project about family history. She was drawing pictures of the house and writing about her grandmother's courage. "Daddy," she said without looking up from her drawing, "some kids at school said their parents think we're being selfish about the house." Michael's heart clenched. "What do you think?" "I think grown-ups sometimes forget what's really important." She held up her drawing, which showed the house with people of different colors standing together in front of it. "Grandma Irene didn't help people because she wanted money. She helped them because it was the right thing to do." "That's true. So we have to do the right thing too, even if it's hard." As Michael helped Elsie get ready for bed, he realized that his 6-year-old daughter had become the moral compass for everyone involved in this fight. Her simple clarity about right and wrong had inspired families across the region, motivated lawyers to work pro bono, and attracted national attention to an issue that might otherwise have been ignored. But tomorrow would bring the city hearing that could determine the fate of the house. Despite all their legal protections and historical documentation, Michael knew that bureaucratic processes could be influenced by political pressure and financial interests. As he tucked Elsie into bed, she looked up at him with complete confidence. "Tomorrow we get to tell everyone why the house is important, right?" "That's right, sweetheart." "Good. Buck and I are ready," looking at his daughter and her faithful companion, both of whom seemed utterly untroubled by the magnitude of what they faced. Michael felt a surge of pride and determination that surprised him with its intensity. His mother had chosen well when she made Elsie the heir to this legacy. Tomorrow they would stand before a room full of officials and developers and explain why some things were too important to be bought and sold, and win or lose, they would do it with the same courage that had sustained generations of people who had found refuge in this house when they needed it most. The city council chambers had never seen a crowd like the one that gathered on the morning of the hearing. People had traveled from across the region, historians, civil rights activists, descendants of Underground Railroad conductors, and families protecting similar properties. Local supporters filled the remaining seats, while overflow crowds watched from monitors set up in adjoining rooms. Michael sat in the front row with Elsie beside him, Buck lying quietly at their feet despite the commotion around them. Margaret Thornton had prepared them for what to expect. The city would present evidence of alleged safety violations. Caldwell's team would argue for economic development. And then their side would have the opportunity to respond. But as Michael looked around the packed chamber, he realized this had become about much more than one house or one development project. The crowd included elderly people who had lived through the civil rights era, young students studying history, and families who understood that some battles were worth fighting. regardless of the practical consequences. Councilman Foster called the hearing to order and immediately established the framework he wanted to control the discussion. We're here today to address concerns about a property at 1247 Elm Street, he announced. While we all appreciate historical preservation, the city has a responsibility to ensure public safety and responsible development. The first presentation came from the city's building inspector, who displayed photographs allegedly showing structural problems, electrical code violations, and safety hazards. Michael recognized none of the damage shown in the pictures, and several shots appeared to be from different properties entirely. Margaret Thornton was taking careful notes, but she had warned Michael that official proceedings like this could be manipulated to support predetermined conclusions. Richard Caldwell's presentation was polished and persuasive, featuring architectural renderings of the proposed shopping complex, economic impact projections, and testimonials from business leaders about the development's potential benefits. He spoke eloquently about the need to balance historical sentiment with practical progress. Nobody wants to destroy history, Caldwell concluded. But we cannot allow misguided preservation efforts to prevent economic opportunity for an entire neighborhood. When it came time for their response, Margaret Thornton stood to address the council, but Elsie suddenly spoke up from her seat. "Excuse me," she said in her clear 6-year-old voice. "May I say something?" The chamber fell completely silent. Councilman Foster looked uncomfortable, clearly not having anticipated this possibility. "This is an official proceeding, young lady. Perhaps your father or your attorney—" "The property belongs to Elsie," Margaret Thornton interrupted firmly. "Under the law, she has the right to address matters affecting her inheritance." Foster couldn't deny this without appearing to silence a child in front of a room full of witnesses and cameras. "Very well, but please keep your remarks brief." Elsie stood up with the kind of natural dignity that seemed to run in her family. Buck rose as well, positioning himself protectively beside her as she walked to the podium that had been adjusted down to accommodate her height. "My name is Elsie Henderson," she began, "and my grandmother left me her house because she trusted me to take care of it." Her voice carried clearly through the chamber's sound system, reaching not just the packed room, but also the television cameras that were broadcasting the hearing live. "The grown-ups here today want to tear down my house to build a store. They say it will make money and create jobs, and maybe that's true. But my house has been helping people for more than 100 years, and that's more important than money." She paused, looking directly at the city council members with the kind of steady gaze that made adults uncomfortable when it came from a child. "Reverend Patterson," she continued, turning to gesture toward the elderly minister in the audience, "slept in my basement when bad people were trying to hurt him for wanting to vote. Mrs. Hayes drove here from Alabama because her house helped people too, and now she's helping me protect mine." The chamber remained absolutely still as Elsie spoke, her words carrying a moral authority that none of the adult speakers had managed to achieve. "My grandmother wrote me a letter that said some things are more important than money, and some responsibilities are more important than being convenient. She said I would understand that better than grown-ups because kids still remember what's right and what's wrong." Elsie looked at Councilman Foster, who had been fidgeting uncomfortably throughout her speech. "Mr. Foster, would you tear down a church to build a store?" "Well, no, of course not. My house is like a church. It's a sacred place where people came when they needed help, when they were scared, when they needed somewhere safe to plan how to make the world better." She gestured toward Buck, who was sitting perfectly still beside the podium. "Buck's family has been protecting this house for 60 years, just like my family has. We're not trying to stop progress. We're trying to save something that can't be replaced once it's gone." Elsie's final words were delivered with quiet certainty that seemed to echo through the chamber. "Some things are worth more than money. Some things are too important to sell. My house is one of those things." As she returned to her seat, the chamber erupted in sustained applause that Councilman Foster had to gavel down repeatedly. But the damage to the development side's argument was already done. A 6-year-old child had articulated the moral case for preservation more powerfully than any adult could have managed. The impact of Elsie's speech reverberated through the chamber as Margaret Thornton rose to present their formal response. But the legal arguments that followed about deed restrictions, federal historic protections, and constitutional property rights seemed almost anticlimactic after a 6-year-old had distilled the entire issue to its moral essence. Dorothy Washington was the next witness, reading from a prepared statement that Margaret Thornton had helped her craft. Her testimony focused on the house's role in the community and the decades of service it had provided to people in need. "I have lived next door to that house for 40 years, she said, her voice steady despite the emotions behind her words. "I watched Irene Henderson maintain it not as an investment property, but as a sacred trust. I saw the people who came there for help, for hope, for a safe place to plan how to make this community better for everyone." She paused, looking directly at Richard Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell talks about economic development and job creation. But what kind of jobs are we creating if we destroy our history to build them? What kind of progress is it if we have to forget where we came from to get where we're going? Reverend Patterson followed with testimony that brought tears to many eyes in the chamber. He spoke about the terror of those days in 1965, about young people who risked everything to claim rights that should have been guaranteed by the Constitution. "That house saved my life," he said simply. "Not just because it gave me shelter, but because it gave me hope. It proved that there were white families willing to risk their own safety to help us fight for justice." He looked around the packed chamber, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "We're not trying to live in the past. We're trying to learn from it. That house is proof that ordinary people can choose to do extraordinary things when they follow their conscience instead of their wallet." The most damaging testimony for the development side came from an unexpected source. Dr. James Mitchell, a structural engineer who had worked for the city for 15 years, had apparently been troubled by the building inspection report presented earlier. "I was not part of the team that prepared the safety assessment presented this morning," he said. "But I have reviewed the photographs and findings, and I have serious concerns about their accuracy." He presented his own photographs of the Henderson house, taken just the previous weekend, showing that most of the alleged structural problems did not exist. "The foundation is solid. The electrical system has been properly maintained, and the overall structural integrity is actually superior to many newer buildings in this city. The house poses no safety risk to the community." Councilman Foster looked increasingly uncomfortable as Dr. Mitchell's testimony continued. "Furthermore, I find it troubling that such significant alleged safety issues were apparently discovered only after the property owner applied for historic designation. In my 15 years with the city, I have never seen building problems manifest so conveniently for development interests." Margaret Thornton's closing argument was brief, but devastating. She presented the original 1855 deed with its perpetual protection clause, the federal historic designation that was now officially approved, and documentation from the National Park Service declaring the house a site of exceptional historical significance. "The law is clear," she concluded. "This property has been protected for over 160 years by deed restrictions that are older than this city's incorporation. It has been protected for the past month by federal historic landmark status. And it has been protected for 6 years by a will that specifically designated a child as its guardian because the adults in this community had lost sight of what really matters. But it was the public comment period that sealed the outcome. One by one, community members stood to speak in support of preservation. Elderly residents shared memories of the house and its role in the neighborhood. Teachers talked about the educational value of preserving civil rights sites. Young parents spoke about wanting their children to grow up understanding the courage of previous generations. Most powerfully, 3 other families who protected similar properties across the region stood together to announce the formation of the Underground Railroad and civil Right Sites Preservation Network, the Henderson House will not stand alone, announced Eleanor Hayes from Alabama. We represent 12 families in 6 states who have been protecting these sacred sites for generations. An attack on one of our properties is an attack on all of them. When the public comment period finally ended, Councilman Foster called for a brief recess before the council voted. But as the chamber buzzed with conversation, it was clear that the political winds had shifted decisively. Richard Caldwell approached Michael during the break, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious frustration. This isn't over, Henderson. There are other ways to achieve development goals, and not all of them require your cooperation. Michael felt Buck tense beside him, the dog's protective instincts triggered by the veiled threat. Mr. Caldwell, my 6-year-old daughter just explained to a room full of adults why your project is wrong. I don't think you understand what you're up against. When the council reconvened, the vote was swift and decisive, by a margin of 6-1, with only Councilman Foster dissenting. The city rejected all building violations and safety concerns, officially recognized the federal historic landmark designation, and approved a resolution supporting the preservation of the Henderson House. As the gavel fell and the chamber erupted in cheers, Elsie looked up at her father with quiet satisfaction. Grandma Irene would be proud, she said simply. Buck wagged his tail once, as if he agreed completely. 6 months after the city council hearing, the Henderson House stood transformed but unchanged, a paradox that seemed fitting for a place that had always balanced preservation with progress. The ivy had been carefully trimmed away from the windows, the wraparound porch had been restored to its Victorian splendor, and the blue front door gleamed with fresh paint. But the changes were respectful, designed to preserve the character that had made the house special for over a century and a half. Michael stood in the front yard on a crisp spring morning, watching as workers installed the final piece of the transformation, a bronze historical marker that would tell visitors about the house's dual role as an underground railroad station and civil rights safe house. The marker had been funded by donations from across the country, part of the wave of support that had followed Elsie's testimony at the hearing. The legal battles were finally over. Richard Caldwell's development company had attempted several more challenges, but each had been defeated by the combination of federal historic protection, the original deed restrictions, and what Margaret Thornton called the most ironclad legal fortress she'd ever constructed around a piece of property. More importantly, the publicity from their fight had sparked a national conversation about preserving civil rights sites. The Underground Railroad and Civil Rights Sites Preservation Network that had emerged from their struggle now protected 43 properties across 12 states, with more families coming forward each month to share their own hidden histories. Elsie came skipping out of the house with Buck at her side, both of them carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of those who have faced down powerful opponents and won. She was carrying a folder of letters, correspondence from school children across the country who had heard her story and wanted to visit the house. "Daddy, Mrs. Morrison says we can start the school tours next month. 23 classes have already signed up." Dr. Angela Morrison had become the house's first official historian, working with Elsie and Michael to develop educational programs that would help visitors understand both the historical significance and the ongoing relevance of the site. The basement safe room had been carefully restored as a museum exhibit, while the attic study had become a research library for scholars studying the intersection of Underground Railroad and civil rights activism. "Are you ready for that many visitors?" Michael asked his daughter. "Buck and I have been practicing," Elsie replied seriously. "We know all the stories now, and we know which rooms are special and why." The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Janet and Carol had eventually come around to supporting the preservation effort, though it had taken months of difficult family conversations. Uncle Robert still grumbled about missed opportunities, but even he had been impressed by the national media attention and the educational grants that had started flowing to the family trust that now managed the property. Most surprisingly, the neighborhood had been revitalized by the attention. Property values had risen as people wanted to live near the historic site. New businesses had opened to serve the growing number of visitors, and the community had rallied around preserving other significant buildings in the area. Richard Caldwell's promised economic development had materialized, but in a form that honored history rather than erasing it. Dorothy Washington had become the house's unofficial ambassador, leading tours for visitors who wanted to hear first-hand accounts of the civil rights era. At 75, she had found a new purpose in sharing stories that she had kept private for decades. "Your grandmother always said this day would come," Dorothy told Michael as they watched Elsie practice her tour guide presentation on Buck, who listened with the patient attention of a dog who understood his role perfectly. What day? The day when hiding would no longer be necessary, when the stories could be told openly and people would understand their importance. That afternoon brought a visitor who completed the circle of their journey. James Washington III, Dorothy's great-nephew and the grandson of Irene's lost love, had driven from California to see the house his grandfather had helped make significant. He was a teacher like his grandfather had been, and he carried with him a box of letters and photographs that filled in the final pieces of the love story that had shaped so much of what followed. "My grandfather never stopped loving your grandmother," James III told Michael as they sat in Irene's restored kitchen. "He married, had children, built a good life in California, but he sent her a Christmas card every year until he died. In his final letter, he told her that their work in this house had been the most important thing he'd ever done." He opened the box to reveal dozens of letters Irene had written to his grandfather over the decades, correspondence that had continued long after their romantic relationship ended, evolving into a lifelong friendship based on shared values and mutual respect. She wrote to him about you and your sisters growing up, about her hopes for future generations, and always about this house. In his final years, he donated money anonymously to help with its maintenance. He wanted to make sure it would survive until the right moment came to tell its story. As evening approached, the house filled with all the people who had become part of their extended family through this journey. Margaret Thornton had driven down from Washington with news that their case had been cited in 3 other successful preservation battles. Reverend Patterson arrived with his grandson, who was documenting civil rights sites for his college thesis. The Hayes family had come from Alabama with updates on their own preservation work, but it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Michael. Watching Elsie show James III the hand-carved bird his grandfather had made for Irene, seeing Buck settle contentedly in the spot where generations of his ancestors had stood guard, and feeling the presence of his mother's wisdom in every room of the house she had protected for so many years. As the sun set through the tall windows of the front parlor, Michael gathered everyone together for what had become a monthly tradition, sharing stories about the house and its role in their community's history. But tonight, he had a special announcement. 6 months ago, we thought we were fighting to save one old house. What we discovered was that we were part of something much larger, a network of families and communities that have been preserving the real story of how change happens in America. He looked around the room at faces that had become dear to him, people who had taught him about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of standing up for principles, even when it's difficult. Elsie and I have decided to establish the Irene Henderson Foundation for Civil Rights Site Preservation. It will provide legal and financial support to families protecting similar properties, and it will help make sure these stories are never lost again. The foundation would be funded by donations that continued to pour in from around the country, along with grants from organizations that recognize the educational value of preserving authentic historical sites. More importantly, it would be guided by the same principles that had shaped Irene's approach to the house, that some things are too important to be measured in purely financial terms. As the gathering wound down and people began to say their goodbyes, Elsie approached her father with a question that had clearly been on her mind. "Daddy, do you think Grandma Irene knew all this would happen when she left me the house?" Michael considered the question seriously, looking around at the restored rooms filled with artifacts and memories, at the bronze marker outside that would ensure the story continued to be told, and at his daughter who had become a symbol of moral courage for people across the country. "I think she knew that you would do the right thing, whatever that turned out to be. She trusted your heart, and your heart led us to all of this." That night, as Michael tucked Elsie into her bed in their own small house on Maple Street, she shared her plans for the summer. "Mrs. Morrison wants me to help write a children's book about the house, and Buck and I are going to visit some of the other families in the network to see their houses and learn their stories." That sounds like important work. It is important work. Grandma Irene always said that every generation has to choose whether to preserve the good things from the past or let them disappear. Our generation gets to choose about the houses. As Michael turned off her bedroom light, Elsie called out one final thought. "Daddy, thank you for letting me keep Grandma Irene's house. Thank you for teaching me why it was worth keeping." Buck settled into his usual spot beside Elsie's bed with a contented sigh. His mission as guardian successfully passed on to a new generation. Outside, the night was peaceful, and somewhere across town, the Henderson house stood ready to welcome its next visitors. School children who would learn about courage, historians who would document the past, and perhaps other families who needed inspiration to protect their own pieces of irreplaceable history. In the morning, there would be tours to give, letters to answer, and preservation work to continue. But tonight, Michael fell asleep knowing that his mother's legacy was secure, that his daughter understood the responsibility she had inherited, and that some things truly are too important to be bought and sold. The house would endure, the stories would continue to be told, and future generations would learn that ordinary people armed with extraordinary courage can indeed change the world, one act of preservation at a time.